I have been doing a mini-series, and what I've been doing is using science to show where the complexity of something is so great, it just couldn't have happened by itself. It's not by chance. And I did that with the immune system about a month ago. And I'm going to do it today with the global climate. I'm going to show what the climate change climatistas actually teach. And then I'm going to show how simple some of these mistakes are that they're making. And then I'm going to talk just a little bit about the reality of our climate and how complicated it really is. So if you'll bear with me, it is going to get a little technical because climate, like meteorology, is mostly mathematical modeling. And even as much as we've seen math modeling fail us during COVID, and if you look at the weather that's supposed to be here like next week, today, a week from today, it probably won't be that weather. So we know math modeling doesn't work really well. And so you shouldn't surprise you that it doesn't work. If it won't work out past a week, it's really hard to get it to work out past, 1,000 years or something. But that's my intent. And one of the things I want to point out here is that there's an underlying belief in the world that science and faith can't mix. And if you buy into the science, you're going to think faith is like the mystical. And the reality is it's not that way at all. There are many, many cases where when we know enough about the science of something, it literally points to God. Now, Brad did a lesson back in September of 2020 where he talked about the Bible's intent is not to teach science. And so I'm not going to step on that because I believe that's absolutely right. There are times that the Bible will refer to something. He used in his lesson the example of the mustard seed being the smallest seed, and it was the smallest seed the Jews knew about, but they didn't know about orchids. And orchids, I think, is actually the smallest seed. So rather than God trying to tell them about orchids that only existed in another hemisphere, he just used what they understood. And so that's not that God doesn't know what the smallest seed is, but the Bible's not intended to teach science. But what happens is periodically our view of science tries to deny the existence of God. And that's when science goes crosswise. And that's kind of what's happening here. So it's not that we Christians deny science. We're not science deniers. Sometimes science is wrong. But it's the science people who tend to deny faith, who tend to deny God. But what I'm going to do is show that science is really on our side in this particular case. When it comes to anthropomorphic global warming, that's the term you're going to hear, anthropomorphic. What that means is man-made, anthro-man, and it's anthropogenic, and genic meaning made. And so anthropogenic global warming is the term that the scientists will use. Most laymen just call it man-made global warming. And they're trying to differentiate that from normal climate that cools and warms every day. And they're trying to make that differentiation. All right, when we look at this, Christians should have some understanding of what God says about the earth and the climate, what he teaches about it, because he does actually have something to say about it. But first I'm going to start with Genesis, and I don't have a slide for this. Most of you should probably know this. If you want to check my math, it's in Genesis chapter 1. The earth was his starting point. When God starts his creation, he starts with the planet Earth. The first thing he does is he creates this void, and he has the Holy Spirit hovering over the waters. The face of the waters is the term he uses. On the second day, he creates the atmosphere and the expanse of water. So my understanding is he then confines it more like to a ball, to a circle, the way we see the earth today as a large globe. On the third day, he separates the land out from the sea. He actually, the language is like he draws the land out from underneath the sea, but he puts dry land and sea together. And so now you have an ocean and or maybe huge rivers, but you have the water and land together. That's on the third day. He also creates plant life on that day. On the fourth day, he creates the sun and the moon. These are two key objects in the sky for the climate that we enjoy. The sun obviously warms us. If it wasn't for the sun, and the earth is in what's called the Goldilocks place, right? It's not too far, not too close. It's in just the right place. Get a little bit closer to the sun, it's too hot. And get a little further from the sun, it's too cold. So he places the earth exactly where it needs to be. And the moon acts as a pump. It is turning the oceans. It pulls the oceans with its gravity. So it pulls them to the left, and then it goes around, pulls them the other way. And the whole time, these tides are moving in and out. And that movement is what helps the oceans create oxygen in it and keeps the plant life alive. So he creates that on the fourth day. And he also mentions at this point seasons and cycles. And then he also makes the entire rest of the cosmos, every other object in space, on the fourth day. And then on the fifth and sixth day, he makes the animal kingdom and man. And my intent isn't to teach us, this actual section of Genesis. But the point I want to point out is, how many days did he work on the earth? How many days did he work on the planet we're standing on? 4. It only took him 1 day to make man. It only took him, 2 days to make the animal kingdom in total. Can't count the birds. 2 days to make the animal kingdom in total, but it took 4 days to make the earth and everything in it. So what I draw out of that is, I don't think he was warming up. I think there's an enormous complexity to this planet we live on that supports the life that we have here and supports his most important creation of all, us, his image bearers. It supports us. So this is like how long it takes you to build a house. It takes much longer to build a house than it does to move into it. And so it's interesting to note that most people think of the earth as just one of the many planets circling the many stars in the galaxy. Not true. The earth is unique in all the universe. It took him 4 days to make it, and he made everything else in the universe on one of those days. And so I think that's important for us to understand about the planet we walk on, the planet we enjoy. And I'm not talking about just the dirt. I'm talking about the atmosphere, the clouds, the water, everything involved in it. But our story takes a turn about this time, and man sins, and he falls. And so I'm going to put my glasses on. My reading's a little bit smaller, but Genesis 3:17, when man does fall, God curses the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it, and in all the days of your life, thorns and thistles shall bring forth to you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. Then starting in Genesis 6, and this is the height of man's falling, the Lord saw the wickedness of man was great on earth, and every intention of his thoughts and his heart were only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the earth, from the land, man, the animals, creeping things, the birds of the heaven, for I am sorry that I've made them. Now, if you know the story, he looks upon Noah, and he finds him worthy, and he has Noah build the ark. The world floods. He destroys it just like he said he would, but he saved those people and all the animals that were on the ark. And then moving forward to Genesis 8, at the end of the flood, as Noah's coming out of the ark, he says in Genesis 8:21, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, hot and cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. So this is the first time he mentions the seasons, although he had mentioned seasons before. I think most biblical scholars believe that the Eden earth was a little different, that it probably had a canopy over it, had a constant temperature. It was the plants were fed from springs up out of the ground. Then the rains come, earth changes. Now there's mountains because Noah's Ark bumps right into one, and the ark stops on Mount Ararat. And now we do have the mountain range. That's a completely different lesson I would love to teach one day. But at this point, what we're seeing is that God has dramatically changed the earth because of the curse and because of the flood. And continuing in chapter 9, I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the cloud, and that's the rainbow, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. And I want to make that point. He's making a sign of the covenant between him and earth itself. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall never again become a flood to destroy the flesh. And when the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature and all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. So if you notice, this covenant's very complicated. The covenant's with the earth. The covenant's with Noah. The covenant is not to flood the earth. The covenant is to not destroy all the other animals, and it is to protect it, and it's for all generations. Okay, so there's a lot packed in there, and I'm going to unpack it just a little bit. 2/3 of his time in creation is spent making the earth, and then only one day he makes the rest of the cosmos. He makes all the other stars and planets, so it shouldn't be too surprising to you that they are just big dead rocks or something like that. At the fall of man, the earth is cursed, and to make farming more difficult, and during the flood, it goes through a massive makeover. The earth we see today, matter of fact, we still have volcanoes, we still have tectonic plate shifting. Noah's flood, the huge event that occurred, has not done. We still see vibrations of it, echoes of it in the world we see today. Hurricanes and things like that. He promises weather and seasons. But God makes his covenant using the rainbow as a sign. Isn't it interesting? Everybody knows how the rainbow is made, right? It's mist, moisture in the air, sun passing through it. So what you're seeing is there's a part of our atmosphere that creates a rainbow that God uses as a reminder of his destruction and that he will never do it again. Okay, so I don't think God is promising just not to flood the earth, but, it's kind of slightly, there's a sleight of hand here but I will let you toxically kill yourself, but I'm not going to flood it. I don't think that's the point here. I think God's making a promise that the earth will not turn against man and God will not turn against the earth. And so we live on a planet that has the ability to sustain us. All right, so that's my first point. But now we have a worldwide global belief that there's an apocalypse coming with melting ice caps, rising seas, threatening floods on all the earth, where all human life can be extinct and all the animals and plants can be destroyed. So a question here, did the supreme being of the universe, who spoke the world into existence, took 4 days to do it, did he make a design mistake? Did he really misunderstand how deep we drill in the ground? Did he fail to? He built those oil reserves that are underground. Those were put there by him. The oil that is underground is not millions of years old. It's 8,000 or 10,000 years old. It takes that long, much longer than that to even make oil. So he put that oil there, and he put it within our reach. It's amazing, it's near the surface. Another amazing thing, isn't it interesting that it outgasses CO2, the very same thing we outgas? I mean, isn't that interesting? The largest energy source in the world, and the byproduct of it is the exact same thing that humans breathe out and all other living animals that breathe. Did he fail to see that we drill that oil? Did he miss that point? Or did he fail to see that we would release the CO2? There'd be an extra CO2 in the atmosphere, and we would kill ourselves before the second coming of Christ? Do you really think he missed that? I mean, I find this insane to even jokingly mention it. Or are we using this resource that we were never supposed to touch? Is this some magical resource he warned us never to touch? Well, let's look at Genesis 9, verses 1 and through 3. God blessed Noah and his sons, and he said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens and everything that creeps on the ground and all the flesh, all the fish of the sea, into your hands they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And I gave you the green plants. I give you everything. Okay? It's a separate sentence. I give you everything. So the earth, it was ours. Now we are the caretakers of it. We're not supposed to abuse it. But I don't think the oil was placed where it is. And I don't know if you've kept up with this. You know, everybody knows the largest oil reserves in the world are in Saudi Arabia and all that, right? Do you know that once we started fracking and doing that sideways drilling and fracking that made the United States under the Trump administration self-sufficient with its own oil? You know what we also discovered? There's 4.8 trillion barrels of oil in the shale under the United States. That amount of shale oil is 3 times the amount of oil in the Saudi Arabian oil reserve. 3 times. The United States is now the oil global capital. Now, of course, we aren't now because our president shut down the drilling and the pipelines. But we have it as a blessing from God. So he gave us what we have here so that we could have food, we could make medicines, we could also make electricity. He gave us that ability. He gave us the ability to understand these things. We could harness the atom. I don't think we are supposed to blow each other up with it, but we can make nuclear energy. He gave us all the fossil fuels that we have. It's just amazing that the fossil fuel, the very thing we have in abundance, that 1 cup of a fuel made from fossil fuels has more energy in it than any other liquid on the planet. That's how powerful gasoline, diesel fuel, oil, that's how kerosene, all those things come from that oil in the ground. And it's so powerful, we have no replacement for it. There is nothing else that will propel an airplane across the ocean, and it can carry its own fuel reserve. Batteries won't do it. So he gave us all this in abundance. And so now I'm going to take a minute to understand the global climate change, their point of view. Now, for the purpose of this, I put up on the slides, let's go to the next slide. So that little green square that says AGCC, that's the initials of the anthropomorphic, or anthropogenic global change, global climate change. That's their term. So while that square is up, I'm teaching you what they believe. So I did that so you wouldn't misunderstand what I'm saying to be actually fact, because a lot of this is not fact. All right, so temperatures. Temperatures have been this is a belief of theirs, temperatures have been very consistent in the past 1,000 to 10,000 years based on research. And until the early 1900s, which is just the Industrial Revolution, the onset of that, which increased that's when the increase of man-made CO2 and anthropogenic global warming took place. On the right, you'll see the very first slide that was done. This slide is the hockey stick slide. So if you go to look into anything about global warming, it'll come up the hockey stick slide. You'll see that. Well, this is the hockey stick slide, and the reason they call it that is you look, it's flat for 1,000 years. The temperature is flat, and then it shoots up at the very end like a hockey stick. Well, if it keeps doing that, if it goes up exponentially like that, it will be too hot to live on Earth, and that's their point. Now that slide was disputed, so they came back with the one on the left. The one on the left was done by a think tank group, and it is undeniable. You cannot deny this one. And the one on the left shows it going back 24,000 years, okay? So we have the temperature, constant temperature for 24,000 years, hockey stick at the end since man discovered fossil fuels. Point number 2, CO2 emissions are from the industrialized world have increased the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere from 200 parts per million, that's what it was believed to have been during all that flat part of the hockey stick, to it's currently at about 385 in most places. It varies differently. In this room we're in, because you're breathing and there's not a lot of air coming in, it might get up to 400 or 500 in here. You won't notice it. But by the way, your breathing mechanism, you don't breathe when you need oxygen. Your body makes you breathe when you have an excess of CO2. When your body senses there's too much CO2 in it, it forces you to gulp in a breath of air. So CO2 is what's causing your body to actually seek out oxygen. So it's up to 400 parts per million. And the point of the slide is to show that the Earth was stable. It was doing just fine until we discovered fossil fuels, and then it hockey sticked. Okay? The third point, there's a delicate balance in the atmosphere. And this delicate balance is the sun comes in radiated from the sun rays come in radiated from the sun. This is the picture on the left. It hits the Earth and warms it. The excess warmth goes right through our atmosphere, goes back into outer space, and so what comes in goes out, stays balanced, so the temperature stays roughly average 67 degrees on all of Earth, and then somewhere between 120 and 10 below anywhere you go. But the average temperature of the Earth remains fairly constant during all that period of time. When you introduce CO2, excess CO2, you get the picture on the right, and all of a sudden the CO2 is acting like a blanket, is blocking the air from radiating. Sun's still coming in, not enough is radiating out, temperature goes up. Then more CO2, temperature goes up more. More CO2, it keeps going up. So there's a delicate balance, and the CO2, the greenhouse gas, is affecting it. All right, and the CO2 is breaking our equilibrium so that we are now considered to be in a runaway state of temperature. And so the climate models all show this. So when you look at the climate models that we have, you will see this slight rise in temperature, and then let me see the next slide. There you go. And so this is just Australia, because it turns out these climate models are localized. So I had to pick one, and this is the one you could find. You see the flat land here, the flat space here, and then there's the hockey stick is in the black, and then everything in red and blue is a model. That's just math models saying it's going to skyrocket, and the temperature goes up 6 or 8 degrees in this model over just till 2100 in the century we're in. So, and 6 or 7 degrees is significant in the model because this runaway thing. The idea is that once you break the equilibrium, then anything you add in heat just makes it worse. Puts more in the air, then it makes it hotter. It's hotter. People use air conditioners. We turn on more coal fuel plants, oil fuel plants. Makes it more CO2. Makes it hotter. So we turn the air conditioners up. This is a cycle. So we're headed to our personal destruction because of this rising temperature, and that's why you see the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which works for the UN. And remember, the UN is now that one government thing that everybody wants the United States to bow to. And so the IPCC is the mothership of global climate change. They're the people driving it outside the United States. The United States is a member of that. And they're wanting us to go back to the levels of fossil fuels that we used in 1890 is what they're based. So that's before air conditioning, before cars. That's kind of where they think we should go. I know this sounds crazy, but this is what they actually are presenting. Okay, and then the last thing is there's a complete consensus on this. So everything I've just shown you has complete consensus behind it. Every developed government, now the undeveloped ones don't believe this because they want to get their fossil fuels and get their energy before they start paying the tax on it. But every developed government, so all of the developed countries in Europe, Japan, the United States, Canada, all the big developed countries, they all sign up to this IPCC committee. And then there's this famous statement. The other thing you cannot miss if you look at global climate change is this statement. 97% of all scientists agree that man-made global warming is harming the planet. That's the problem. That's their statement. And it's on NASA's website. These people that can put people in space. If anybody would know something about space, it'd be these guys, right? Of course, they get their money from the government, so they'll put anything up there they need. If you disagree with this point of view, you're either going to get defunded, you're going to get demonetized on Google. When I did the Google search to do this, I had looked at some of this stuff about 3 or 4 years ago. I found tons of it. It's all gone. Now, it's still on Google, but you cannot find it with the search engine. The search engine, I even put in climate deniers, and I still got the climate change people. And so fortunately, I had saved some references and was able to get back to the Google pages that I had looked at before. But if you don't agree with this, you're going to be canceled. You're going to be labeled a denier. You're ignorant. You're the modern day version of a snake oil salesman, because everybody knows 97% of the scientists say it's true. Who do you think you are? So that's it. By the way, on Biden's first day in office, he signed an executive order saying the science is settled, which means you don't get to, there's no more vote. All right, so now I'm going to turn away from this. I'm going to start with my premise. My premise is that if we understood the science better, it would indicate a supreme being is in control of this, if we understood it better. The triune God of the Bible made this planet. It took 4 days to do it, and he did something that is not going to let us commit, the equivalent of global suicide. He's not going to do it. And I use Romans 1, 19 through 20, because it says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that he made." So if we look at the things that he made, what are we going to see? We're going to see his eternal power. Well, his eternal power is much higher than our ability to put CO2 in the air. Okay, so that's kind of my premise. So now let's look at some of the things that you can see. There are a few people that stand up against this climate change, and they try to cancel them. There's one man in particular, and this man is he is a national jewel. His thesis papers and the things he wrote defined how the thermals move between, how energy moves between all these things on the planet, and he's constantly telling people they're wrong. And I'm going to show this. So on the left, you see the university degrees that our climatologists have today. And I can't read my page, so I'm going to look. You can have a master's in global sustainability. That sounds pretty cool, right? Or you can have a master's in climate change and risk management, or in adaptation and governance, laws. Or you can have it on climate change science and policy, political laws. And those are what you get a degree in today. This is the man I'm talking about, Richard Lindzen. Well, he's got a Harvard BS in physics. He's got a master's in applied mathematics. That's the really hard stuff. He's got a PhD in applied mathematics. He did his doctoral thesis on radiative photochemical processes. He looked at how the ozone reacts to radiated energy. The guy has been awarded more awards. He's like the Sloan University professor emeritus at MIT until he retired about 3 or 4 years ago. And you don't get to that position. You don't get to be the professor at MIT emeritus by being ignorant. This guy is super smart, and he's got the math background to understand what's going on, as opposed to the people that are making all of the policies today. They have these general studies backgrounds. All right, so I did a lot of my research, and I just kept coming across this one man all the time. All right, so that's, first of all, we need to make sure we're listening to the right scientists. All right, climate and weather are not the same thing. Weather looks at about a 2-week window, and it tries to say whether it's going to rain or wind's going to blow. It's very local. It's usually just in the area we see, like west central Texas or the western United States. Every radio station, every news channel you watch that has weather subscribes to a weather service. They subscribe to a set of weather models, and those weather models are called ensembles. And they'll buy an ensemble weather service, and that's why sometimes you'll hear them saying, well, we think the cold's coming in today, but other models say it's going to come in tomorrow. You ever heard that? You'll hear them. Where you see it the most is when a hurricane's coming. They'll show you 15 plots of the hurricane. And what will they say about each plot? Well, this is the northern model, and this is this model. That's how they use models in weather. And weather predicts things for just a couple of days, or maybe a week or two, or the weather does. Climate is about how energy is transferred between the sun coming in and the earth releasing that energy going out. Very different. The models are similar, but it's not the same science. All right. So when they did their hockey stick projections, if you'll notice, what the slide on the left is the one that I showed you that they used initially. The slide on the right is some scientists taking the exact same data and interpreting it a little differently. And notice how not flat it is. The hockey stick is gone now. It's not flat. Notice the big spike at the end is not that unusual. It's happened before. By the way, the people doing this slide is the reason why they did the 24,000 year slide, was to shut them up. But you got to ask yourself, where do they get all these temperature readings, okay? The thermometer was invented in the 1600s. It wasn't used in any form or fashion very commonly until 1880. And it wasn't used for weather challenges to discover, to actually record weather until the early 1900s. And so where are they getting these temperatures from? Well, they use proxies. This is what the entire thermal assumptions are based on proxies. And guess what? It's tree rings and ice cores. And that's great because trees, you know, there's not 10,000-year-old trees, but there are trees that have these tree rings, and you can tell that a tree did well that year or didn't do well that year by the thickness of the you know, how fast it grew. The rings will be further apart, and the closer are they together, they didn't grow that much. But do you think temperature is the only variable for a tree ring? What about water? I personally think it matters a whole lot more whether it got rained on than whether it was 72 or 74 degrees. Remember, we're talking about 6 degrees. So the chance of you reading these tree rings and knowing what the temperature was 5,000 years ago is pretty small. You're going to make a lot of assumptions. The other one's ice cores. Well, ice cores will show you things like, you know, plant sediment and things like that. It also just shows you, you know, snowfall. You'll see it has like snowfall rings. There's lines in there, but it's even less clear. So if you use these as your proxies to tell you what temperature was prior to 1900, you're going to have a lot of error in your math. You're not going to get the math exactly right. So one of the problems we have is their assumption of a flat, constant temperature spiking because of fossil fuels is incorrect because they don't know really what the temperatures were prior. The Earth has been, matter of fact, we know we came out of a mini ice age back in the 1600s, and there was another cooling cycle in about 200 years ago. So we know about these 200-year cycles, these 400-year cycles, and there's even 1,000-year cooling cycles where the Earth changes. So flat is wrong. It's just wrong. Too crude of a mechanism to use. Okay, so is CO2 a harmful greenhouse gas? First question we got to ask is CO2 is the thing they're trying to cut back on. Is it really harmful? Well, there was a study done where they took saplings from the exact same parent tree, put them in 4 different greenhouses, ran one at ambient CO2, which I think you can't read the numbers, but it was around 300, 385, and I wrote the numbers of the 2 middle ones up here, up to 500, and the guy's holding a sign that's the percent. So ambient temperature, ambient CO2 levels, 150%, 300%, 3 times, or 4.5 times. And what do you notice about the tree as it moves to the right? The tree consistently gets larger the more CO2 it's exposed to. Why do you think that is? Well, most of us learned in elementary school, trees eat CO2. That's their oxygen. They're the ones that take in CO2 and spit out O2. That's the reason why our planet stays with as much oxygen as it has. The trees do great in this. Matter of fact, if you walk under the canopy of a tree, like a huge rainforest, the CO2 level under the canopy can exceed 600. And the plants under there, you can barely walk. They love it under there because CO2 is not a poison gas. If it was only CO2, we couldn't breathe there. We breathe oxygen. But at 200 parts per million, 400 parts per million, 800 parts per million, it's not a poisonous gas. There's a scientific reason why plants do this. And I only want to show this because it's kind of important for you to know this little fact. Plants have pores in their leaves. Whatever their mechanism, whatever the plant uses to absorb CO2, it has openings in it, tiny microscopic openings, that the CO2 enters the plant and it goes through its photosynthesis cycle. If there's not much CO2, the plant reacts by putting more pores into its leaves. More pores lets the water the plant work so hard to get up from the roots, it lets it back out again. It evaporates back out. So a plant in higher CO2 will have lower pore counts. They'll have smaller pores or less pores. They'll retain water better, and they grow better. So plants love CO2, and it's not gonna hurt them. Okay, so next question. How about higher CO2? Will higher CO2 cause the temperature to increase? Well, here's where I'm going to get a little geeky here. So Max Planck, who, if you're an engineering nerd, you know who Max Planck is. In 1918, he won the Nobel Prize, and he's most famously known for Planck's constant. And he was working on energy releases. He's working on energy. Well, one of his early works was to determine how energy is radiated off the face of the Earth. And so this slide, the blue line that makes the humped curve is normal radiation if nothing's interfering with it, okay? The black line is what it looks like on Earth when there's 200 parts per million. This is a math model because Max Planck was a mathematician. And you see that dip right where it says CO2, the dip just right of center. That dip is the greenhouse gas effect, that dip. Because what happens is less energy is released at that frequency. This is frequency across the bottom, energy released across the side. And so at that particular frequency, which is a very common frequency, you have that dip, which is less energy being released into space when CO2 is present. And you see that dip there. Now the red one, you can't see the red line. There's a red line there too. They ran the same math model at 400 parts per million, and the red line is right on top of the blue line. When the red lines are on top of each other, what that means is the effect of CO2 has maxed out. Adding more CO2 to the atmosphere is not going to change that bubble anymore. Guess what? CO2 has an effect on our greenhouse gas, but it's limited, and it's limited to at around 200, 250. So in other words, the energy continues to pass through the CO2 even if there's more of it. The thing I want to look at is this global consensus of all scientists, right? So that study, and I don't have a slide for this, that study of 97%, it was done surprisingly by some unknown professor at a university in Australia that's not even a famous university for global climate warming or change or anything. What he did is what's called a mega study. And what he did is took 11,000 reports done on climate, and he went through them all, and he came back, and the headline of his report was 97% of all scientists agree based on this 11,000 separate documents. And he came through with that. But if you read his own abstract, it's on the internet, you can do it. An abstract, for any scientific paper, the abstract is the paragraph in front that summarizes everything he knew. Because scientists are lazy too, and sometimes they just want to read the abstract, they don't want to read all the report. So there's an abstract. And the abstract tells you the rough details of it. So in his abstract of the 11,000, where he said 97% agree, 66% shared no opinion whatsoever on global warming. So it's not 97%. 67% of them, or 66%, had zero opinion, didn't even make an opinion. Of the remaining 34%, half of those documents were written by the media. He was looking at media reports. They're not scientists, they don't count either. So of the remaining 15%, 97% of them who wrote those papers agreed with it. But if you know anything about the university system, if you're going to write a paper, if you want to get funded, you're going to say it's global warming. If you say it's not global warming, you're going to get canceled. So it's no surprise that 97% of the ones that said something agreed with it. Now what's interesting, this guy Richard Lindzen is the most prolific author on global climate in the world. Not a single one of his papers is in this 11,000. So you think maybe they selected the ones? So it's 97% of all the scientists who they knew already agreed with global warming agree with global warming. is the real way to say that. That's what a hack job this is. And the fact that NASA puts it up on the thing tells you I wouldn't get on one of their spaceships anymore. I'd go with Elon Musk. So I know I'm short of time. I'm going to tell you as much as I understand what's really going on in our climate. And this may be a little geeky. All right, the Earth has many systems that actually maintain its equilibrium. This idea that we can spit a bunch of extra CO2 out and the Earth's going to react to it is wrong. So here's just a handful of them. There's probably 20, but some of them I don't understand, and so I didn't use those. Water. The Earth has this huge amount of water in it. What does water do? It turns to vapor and ice, right? Does anybody remember the math formula for turning ice to water, or water to ice? It's 540 coulombs per gram. It takes energy out of the air to turn it into ice. That's not energy just to cool it more. That's energy to actually change its physical property from a liquid to a solid. So it literally removes energy. Remember heat, the heat coming in from the sun, another word for heat is energy. So everything we're going to talk about is storing, moving, or reducing energy. All right? So when water turns to ice, it steals a ton of energy out of the air to do that. So all the polar caps, all the snow you see on the mountains, all of that stuff is an enormous, I mean probably more than all the energy produced in the United States is what it takes to turn it into ice. So water turning into ice uses energy. Water turning to vapor when you have evaporation, that also uses energy, okay? So all the water that moves between ice and vapor is using up energy that does not have to escape back into space. All right, the ocean itself takes heat out of the atmosphere. Now the ocean's amazing because I mentioned how the moon makes the ocean move. There are currents in the ocean, and if you want, you can go look this up. They're well-known currents. El Niños, we know about the 7-year El Niños, right? Because they come up the coast and cause it to rain here a lot every 7 years. That's one of these returning currents. There's hundreds of those in the ocean. So the ocean picks up the heat from the air and puts it in the ocean and then runs it around, takes it other places, right? And so what it's going to do is kind of, if it's too hot in one area, it's going to neutralize that by taking heat out, and someplace later where it's too cold, it's going to release that energy. All right? The ocean also cycles temperatures from the top of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean. It cycles water this way. So the ocean can absorb an enormous amount of energy and then send it down. It's part of why the reason the ocean beneath us, it may get colder, but it's not, it's not minus, 200 Kelvin. It is actually a reasonable temperature. So the ocean itself, the giant thing we have as an ocean on our planet, is both absorbing energy and moving it from place to place. Clouds. So clouds are the vapor things you see. You can see a cloud. There's also moisture vapor. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But clouds, so clouds, when they evaporate, clouds come up, then the jet stream that's created by the Earth's rotation moves the clouds from west to east across and sometimes they're north and south. I know the jet stream can move, but it's generally from west to east, and it goes that way all the way across the Earth because that's the way the Earth moves. That is taking energy from this location, and when you evaporate the moisture, it takes the energy, puts it in the cloud. The cloud then goes up, can go up miles. I talked about thunderstorms going up to 40,000 feet. The high cirrus clouds you see, the little wispy ones, they can go up, 5 miles up into space, and then they act as a reflector. The sun comes in, hits that cirrus cloud, and reflects back out. Doesn't reflect at all, but some of it reflects out. They also act as a blanket. They try to keep the air in. So they're doing both things. If enough vapor gets in there, it turns into a real cloud with thunderstorm. It lowers down in the atmosphere. It moves around until it can hold no more moisture, and then it rains that moisture back down on Earth, either in the form of snow, ice, sleet, or water. Okay, so that's a lot of energy moving things around all the time. Water vapor. All right, water vapor is not clouds. Water vapor is what we typically refer to as humidity, right? So water vapor is that stuff that's in the air that you can see through most of the time. On a really foggy day, you can't see through it, but that's also water vapor. Water vapor is the largest greenhouse gas. It's the reason why CO2 has a small impact, because water vapor is so much larger per parts per million. it has the ability to absorb more water when it's cold, I'm sorry, when it's hot, and less water when it's cold. And so it is reactive to temperature. So you have temperature, it'll absorb more water as it gets hotter, less water as it gets cooler. So you realize what's going on here is the hotter the Earth gets, all these things kick in. Clouds form, vapor forms, it rains, it snows, the ocean absorbs it. You have all these active things. Not a one of them was mentioned by the global climate change people, right? Not a one of them. They say the Earth is fragile. I'm telling you, the Earth is not fragile. The Earth is able to handle everything we can throw at it, and humans have zero impact on the climate. We might have had a 0.2% impact on it, but we've had very little impact on it. So the Earth is not fragile, and neither is the climate. Now, it may take, something may happen, like a volcano erupts, and then you have a bunch of cloud and dust in the air, and it may take a year for all that volcanic ash to leave the air. It doesn't react right away. The Earth is kind of it's a slow reactor. It's one of the things they miss also. The Earth, and this is something Richard Lindzen talks about a lot, is the Earth is neither fragile nor is it an immediate response. And that's what throws a lot of people off. All right? Now, what's interesting about this complete consensus, the final kicker is in their own reports, the IPCC, remember that's the group under the United Nations that tells us, you know, to cut back on our fossil fuels. They put these reports together about every other year. Every country that wants to submits a report on their status of global warming and all their status of all their research. And then there's a couple of committee reports that they do. And those reports they have varied names. I didn't write them all down. But going through those reports, I didn't do it. This very nerdy scientist did. And here's some of the things he found that are counter to what they're telling us, that says there's no climate catastrophe coming. First is that the oceans have been rising for the past 20,000 years. So when they talk about ocean rising, and it's really funny. I think we were talking about this last night. You know that they don't really believe this when Obama buys a $27 million property on Martha's Vineyard right on the ocean, and he believes the ocean's rising. Who would buy that much land right where it's going to flood if in the next 20 or 30 years we're going to have a massive flood? And you wouldn't be able to get insurance. If insurance companies believed that, you couldn't insure that house. So there is no massive flood. It is rising. My wife and I went to Venice, and they will show you, buildings that are a little bit underwater now that used to be not underwater back when they built Venice in the 1600s. So the water's risen. Not due to global warming, because it rose before we discovered oil. It's just been rising. So that's the first thing is sea level's been rising all along. That's not an indicator of global climate disaster. It's the continued effect from the Great Flood. All right. Also buried in his article are these reports. Now I don't think the words are probably, well, maybe you can read them. So it says, heat waves are now no more common than they were. Now these are their reports. These are the reports the global climate change people are using to force us to tell us the world's ending and we have to get rid of fossil fuels. Right in the report, heat waves are now no more common than they were in the 1900s. That's when we found fossil fuel, right? It's not hotter. Global fires has declined more than 25% since 2003. Again, has nothing to do with the climate, has more to do with forest management. Greenland's ice sheet isn't shrinking any more now than it was 8 decades ago. 8 decades ago was when we found the oil, right? So all this stuff you see about the polar bears got nowhere to sleep and all, glaciers are always melting and new ones are always forming. That's just the way the North Pole and the South Pole work. But the shrinking ice lands is nothing. Here's another one. No detectable human impact on hurricanes over the past century. How many times do you hear it? We had a whole bunch more hurricanes. That's because of global warming, right? We just have a lot of hurricanes come and go. How about this one? The net economic impact of a 6-degree Celsius warming, if it were to happen, would be minimal. There's no economic impact. It's not going to end the world. It's not going to do anything. So once again, once we know the truth, once we see the facts, what does it support? It supports an extremely complex system that God created to protect us in this world even against ourselves, discovering oil, which he put there for us, and not having clean enough mufflers. I think the air is cleaner now than it was when I was a child. And so God has done, when he spent those 4 days making the earth, he made it so that it will protect us, and until he chooses to destroy this world. That's when it'll end, is in the second coming. When Christ comes, this world will be replaced with a new heavens and a new earth, but until then, it's going to be sunny skies and clear sailing, and there's going to be thunderstorms and hurricanes and rain and all that stuff you've seen all your life. So God is the supreme creator. He's able to shake off anything we did. He absolutely understood that we would find the oil. He absolutely understood that we would have the intellect to harness the atom, to do all these things, and he built the earth so that we couldn't hurt it. And isn't it curious, again, I'll say it again, isn't it curious that fossil fuels exhale the exact same thing you and I are exhaling right now? I mean, it could have been anything. It could have been putting out sulfurous oxide, deadly gases, but it doesn't. It puts out CO2. CO2, the very thing the plant kingdom lives on. And so I think God is in control. The promises he made to us at the end of the flood, that he would protect the earth, that he would not destroy it again, that all flesh would survive for all generations, that's as true today as it was the day he said it. Because God's promises, you can take them to the bank. He always keeps his promises. And so I'll close by just saying it was interesting to do this study. I thought it would be much easier than this. I thought it wouldn't take me this long, but I thought it was important for us to understand, as we see people freaking out about COVID and freaking out about viruses and global warming and all, the reality, God's in control. He's in control, and you put your faith in him. He will guide you to the promised land, and this land will not be pulled out from underneath you.